7:42 a.m., March 14, 1941. The sky over RAF Kenley was the color of cold steel, and Beatrice Shilling stood motionless beside the runway. A hurricane engine roared to life a few yards away, the sound she'd heard 1,000 times before. But this morning it felt heavier. She watched the pilot climb into his cockpit, fasten his straps, and prepare for another mission that might be his last. She wasn't military. She wasn't a pilot. But she knew those engines better than anyone in Britain, and she also knew that every time one of them dived toward the channel, there was a 50-50 chance it would die before the pilot ever saw his target. For 11 months, the Royal Air Force had been losing men to a problem no bullet had caused. The pattern never changed. The British pilot dives, the engine coughs, the propeller freezes, and in that split second of silence, the German fighter flips around, lines up the shot, and fires. Shilling had read the after-action reports. She'd pored over the maintenance logs, circled the same words again and again. Engine cut out during dive. She'd interviewed the survivors, the lucky few who managed to glide their crippled Spitfires back to base. Every story pointed to the same flaw. The Merlin carburetor flooded whenever the aircraft pushed into -G. A simple quirk of physics, and a fatal one. The Luftwaffe didn't suffer from it. Their Daimler-Benz engines used fuel injection. No floats, no floods, no hesitation. They could roll, invert, and dive with the same smooth roar. For British pilots, every pursuit was a gamble. Rolls-Royce was already designing a fix, a pressure carburetor that would solve everything someday. But someday meant 1943 at best, and 1943 might as well have been another lifetime. The war wasn't waiting. Every morning, Shilling watched men she knew by name walk across the tarmac with quiet bravery. They joked, smoked, smiled for ground crew photos, then climbed into machines that might kill them before the enemy ever saw them. One of them was Squadron Leader Davies, 24 years old, 41 missions, 3 kills. Twice he'd lost power in a dive. Twice he'd come back shaking, alive only because of instinct and altitude. When he passed her that morning, he nodded politely, assuming she was just another clerk from headquarters. He had no idea she was the engineer responsible for the one weakness he couldn't outfly. In her leather satchel, beneath a folder of typed reports, was something small, a brass disc, precisely machined, no larger than a coin. It wasn't part of any official program. No one had authorized it, but she'd tested it for weeks, watched it work, and knew it could change everything. By noon, that tiny brass ring would either save the Royal Air Force or end her career before the next sortie even returned. The problem that nearly crippled the Royal Air Force didn't come from German bullets. It came from inside their own engines. It began quietly. In the summer of 1940, Britain had just upgraded to 100-octane aviation fuel, a move meant to squeeze more power out of the Merlin engines that drove Spitfires and Hurricanes into the sky. The results were impressive. More boost pressure, more speed, more climb rate. A Spitfire Mach II could now chase a Messerschmitt Bf 109 at 370 miles per hour. On paper, it looked like Britain had finally leveled the playing field. But in the chaos of real combat, something was going wrong. Whenever a RAF pilot shoved his stick forward into a steep dive, the maneuver every fighter depended on to survive, a dogfight, the engine would suddenly choke. Fuel flooded the carburetor, the mixture went rich, and the mighty Merlin would cough, sputter, and die. For a second and a half, the aircraft became nothing more than a glider. That was all the time a German pilot needed to close the distance, line up his guns, and fire. It wasn't pilot error. It wasn't bad luck. It was a design flaw in the Skinner's Union carburetor, a flaw nobody had figured out how to fix. But one woman refused to let it go. Beatrice Shilling, the quiet, razor-focused engineer at Farnborough's Royal Aircraft Establishment, understood carburetors better than anyone alive. She joined in late 1939, just weeks after Britain declared war. In an entire department full of men, she was one of only 2 women, and the other one typed letters. Her official title was Principal Technical Officer, Carburetor Research Division, but to most of her male colleagues, she was just that odd woman in the lab coat. Some whispered that women had no place in engineering. Others ignored her altogether. Shilling didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply went back to her bench, picked up her tools, and kept working. Because she knew every stalled engine meant a dead pilot. Tilly had been taking machines apart since she was 14. That year, she'd saved enough money to buy a second-hand Norton motorcycle. stripped the two-stroke engine down to its bolts, learned each valve and piston by hand, and rebuilt it better than before. By her mid-20s, she wasn't just riding, she was racing. At Brooklands, she'd clocked an average speed of 106 miles per hour, earning the prestigious Gold Star, a distinction only two women had ever achieved. Racing had taught her something that couldn't be learned in textbooks: how engines felt under pressure, the sound before a misfire, the vibration before a failure, the delicate line between power and destruction. And now, as Spitfires and Hurricanes fell from the sky, that instinct became her weapon. By the winter of 1940, Tilly had spent months dissecting every report from returning pilots. The stories were identical. The moment a British plane nosed down, the Merlin's carburetor flooded. German planes, with their direct fuel injection, had no such weakness. They could dive, roll, or invert without losing an ounce of power. The British engineers at Rolls-Royce were working on a long-term fix, a new carburetor that could handle negative G-forces, but production would take years. The war wasn't waiting. Tilly started sketching an idea one cold January evening. On her workbench sat a brass washer, barely the size of a coin. To anyone else, it looked insignificant, just another scrap of metal. But to Shilling, it was the simplest answer to an impossible problem. The carburetor flooded because fuel could flow too freely when gravity reversed. So what if you didn't stop the flow, just restricted it? Her concept was disarmingly elegant: a small brass disc with a perfectly calculated hole drilled at the center. It wouldn't block the fuel entirely, just slow it enough to prevent flooding during negative G. The Merlin would still get all the fuel it needed, but never more than it could burn. She built the first prototype herself on a lathe, a tiny, thimble-shaped piece of brass, 0.1 to 5 inches wide, with a 0.04-inch orifice. The dimensions had to be exact. Too large, and the carburetor would still choke; too small, and the engine would starve. She tested 17 variations before finding the one that balanced perfectly. After that, she refined the design into a flat washer, easier to make, easier to install, and easier to replace. Bench tests looked promising. On the test stand, the engine stayed steady through simulated dives, but tests weren't combat, and Shilling wasn't satisfied with theory. She needed to see it work in the air. There was one problem: bureaucracy. RAF regulations forbade unauthorized modifications. Installing an unapproved part on a combat aircraft wasn't just frowned upon, it was illegal. If her restrictor failed and a pilot died, she could face a court-martial, or worse. So, she made a choice: she wouldn't ask permission. She'd prove it worked first, and ask forgiveness later. That March morning at RAF Kenley, Tilly arrived with 6 brass washers wrapped in oiled cloth, and one willing accomplice, Sergeant William Cooper, a mechanic who'd spent 3 years maintaining Merlin engines. He'd seen 19 pilots die from engine failures. He didn't need convincing. When Shilling showed him the washer, he didn't question her plan. He simply nodded, grabbed his toolkit, and followed her to the dispersal area. A Hurricane sat waiting on the tarmac, engine idling, its pilot, squadron leader Davies, running through pre-flight checks. He didn't know it yet, but his aircraft was about to carry the first real test of the device that could change the war. Cooper worked quickly. He disconnected the fuel line between the pump and the carburetor, slipped the washer into place, and sealed it with a clean weld. 60 seconds of work, invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for it. Shilling double-checked the weld, clean, tight, precise. Davies had no idea his plane was now carrying an unapproved experimental modification. Shilling hadn't told him, hadn't told command, hadn't told anyone except Cooper. At 8 a.m., the Hurricane's Merlin roared to full throttle. The aircraft lifted from the runway, climbing into the pale morning sky. Shilling watched through her binoculars as it banked south over the channel. 2 more Hurricanes joining in formation. If her calculations were wrong, Davies wouldn't come back. She stood beside Cooper on the runway, hands clasped, her mind racing with equations. The whole diameter, the flow rate, 1.5 seconds of negative G. It should work. But theory wasn't reality. Minutes dragged into an hour. The radios stayed silent. Every possibility ran through her mind. No contact with the enemy, or contact so heavy they hadn't time to report. Or the worst possibility, Davies down somewhere over France, a smoking crater marking the failure of her invention. Then, at 9:37 a.m., the controller's voice broke the silence. 3 Hurricanes inbound, 2 minutes out. She raised her binoculars. 3 dark silhouettes appeared against the morning haze. All 3 planes, No losses. The Hurricanes touched down one after another, wheels bouncing on the runway. Davies' aircraft rolled to a stop near the hangar. He cut the engine, climbed out, and pulled off his helmet, grinning. That alone was enough to make Shilling's heart stop. Pilots didn't smile after combat patrols. Not unless something extraordinary had happened. Cooper got there first. Any trouble with the Merlin, sir? He asked. Davies turned to him, then to Shilling. Trouble? Best she's ever run, he said. Dove onto Messerschmitt's overdungeness. Full negative G engine never missed a beat. Shilling could barely speak. She asked for details. Every moment of the engagement. Davies described the dive, 14,000 feet down, 400 miles an hour, pinned against his harness, waiting for the sputter, the cough, the cutout that never came. Instead, the Merlin had howled with full power all the way through. He'd fired a 3-second burst and watched one Messerschmitt break away trailing smoke. For the first time in 11 months, a British pilot had dived and lived. When Davies finished, he looked back at Cooper and grinned again. Whatever she did, he said, nodding toward Shilling, put that thing in every Hurricane on this base. Today, when Squadron Leader Davies told Beatrice Shilling to install her little brass washer in every Hurricane on base, she hesitated for half a second, not because she doubted the device, but because she knew what it meant. Once they started, there would be no turning back. It wasn't authorized, it wasn't approved, and if anyone higher up found out too soon, she could lose her career, maybe even face a court-martial. But Davies didn't care about authorization. He cared about survival. He'd buried too many friends in the last 6 months. 19 pilots lost, not to enemy fire, but to engines that betrayed them at the worst possible moment. If they want to court-martial me, he told her, they can do it after the war. For now, we're flying with this. By that afternoon, Sergeant Cooper and his crew had fitted for more Hurricanes with the brass restrictor. It took less than 15 minutes per aircraft. Disconnect the line, insert the washer, weld, and test for leaks. Clean, quick, invisible. Shilling had brought 6 restrictors that day. She kept one for testing. The rest went straight into combat. Over the next 3 days, 5 Hurricanes from RAF Kenley flew 14 patrols and 12 dogfights. Not a single engine failure. Not one. Pilots reported something astonishing. Not only did the Merlins run smoothly through dives, they actually seemed to pull harder at altitude. Steadier, cleaner, almost eager. Word spread fast. By March 18, 1941, every squadron commander in No. 11 group had heard the rumors. A brass washer that saves your life, they called it. Phones at Farnborough rang non-stop. Commanders wanted her at their stations. Now, could she bring more restrictors? How fast could they be made? Could she teach their ground crews to install them? That was the problem. Supply. Tilly had built the first batch herself on a small ray lathe, but she needed thousands, maybe tens of thousands. Precision machining, brass stock, quality control, all of it required official support. For that, she needed the Air Ministry. In wartime Britain, that usually meant months of paperwork, lost memos, and committee meetings, but not this time. Her report reached the desk of Air Marshal Sholto Douglas within 2 days. By the 4th, the modification had been approved for mass production. The Air Ministry called it a war-winning innovation. Rolls-Royce got the contract. They could build 500 restrictors a week, enough to begin immediate rollout to every fighter station in southern England. Shilling was assigned a team, 3 engineers from Farnborough, 2 civilian mechanics, and orders to supervise installations personally. The device was simple enough that it didn't require grounding aircraft for long. That alone made it priceless. The Battle of Britain might have ended, but Luftwaffe raids continued daily. Fighter Command couldn't afford to pull squadrons off the line, so Tilly did what she'd always done best. She got on her motorcycle, her old silver Norton, the same machine that had made her a legend at Brooklands, and hit the road. Tools in one saddlebag, brass washers in the other. By March 25th, the first production run, 600 restrictors, was ready. 40 RAF stations were waiting. More than 3,000 Merlin engines needed modification. Her first stop was Biggin Hill, the busiest station in No. 11 Group. 32 Spitfires, 21 Hurricanes, for squadrons rotating through constant patrols. She arrived at 0800 sharp. Group Captain Grace met her at the gate, a tall man with gray at his temples and exhaustion in his eyes. He'd lost 7 pilots to engine failures in the last 2 months. When Shilling explained the device, he simply nodded. Start immediately, he said. The work began before breakfast. 4 aircraft at a time. Each installation took 12 minutes. Disconnect, fit, weld, test. The welding had to be flawless. A weak seal could cut off fuel flow entirely at altitude. Shilling inspected every single one. When she found a weld she didn't like, she ordered it redone on the spot. 3 restrictors were rejected that morning for minor flaws. Pilots gathered around between sorties, curious and skeptical. One of them, Flight Lieutenant James Lacey, a Cambridge engineering graduate with 41 combat missions, finally asked her how something as small as a washer could fix such a complex problem. Tilly smiled and explained it like a teacher. The flow dynamics of liquid fuel, the behavior of float chambers under -G, the principle of controlled restriction. Lacey's eyebrows lifted halfway through her explanation. Brilliant simplicity, he said quietly. By March 28th, every one of Biggin Hill's 53 Merlin engines had been modified. 0 malfunctions, 0 failures. Shilling and her team moved north, Hornchurch, North Weld, Tangmere, station after station, the pattern repeating itself. Ground crews worked 12-hour shifts. Pilots flew patrols within hours of installation. Every report came back the same. The engines ran flawlessly. By early April, the restrictor had a name, a nickname, really, coined by Sir Stanley Hooker, the quick-witted chief engineer at Rolls-Royce's supercharger division. They called it Miss Shilling's Orifice. It was a bit cheeky, a bit improper, the kind of gallows humor that thrived in wartime barracks. Tilly just laughed. After 6 years working with fighter pilots and mechanics, she'd learned that humor was how men survived fear. If a joke helped them remember to trust her invention, she'd take it. Within weeks, Miss Shilling's Orifice spread across every airfield in Britain, faster than the restrictor itself. Some pilots refused to fly without it. Commanders backed them up. Too many good men had died to call this superstition. By mid-April 1941, the transformation was undeniable. German intelligence began noticing changes in their after-action reports. British fighters weren't breaking off dives anymore. Their attacks were sharper, faster, more aggressive. The Luftwaffe had lost its advantage. By the end of April, more than 2,100 Merlin engines, every Spitfire and Hurricane in fighter command, had been fitted with the restrictor. Even reserve aircraft and training units got them. Rolls-Royce began adding the device directly on the production line. The official pressure carburetor was still years away. Rolls-Royce estimated 1943 at the earliest. But the brass washer worked so perfectly that some engineers wondered if a redesign was even necessary. Why rebuild an entire fuel system when a 50-cent piece of brass had solved the problem? Tilly knew the answer. The restrictor was never meant to be permanent. It was a stopgap, an elegant, brilliant one, but temporary. True engineering demanded a full solution. The pressure carburetor would come eventually, but until then, her small brass washer, Miss Shilling's Orifice, would keep British pilots alive. And for Beatrice Shilling, that was enough. The numbers didn't lie. RAF Fighter Command kept records for everything: sorties flown, aircraft lost, confirmed kills, engine failures. And when the reports for March and April 1941 were placed side by side, the change was undeniable. Before Beatrice Shilling's little brass washer, engine failures during diving combat stood at 37%. Nearly 4 out of every 10 dives ended in silence, the Merlin engine choking mid-maneuver, pilots pulling back helplessly as German Messerschmitts slipped away untouched. But after the restrictor's installation, failures dropped to less than 0.5%. It was as if a curse had been lifted. The pilots didn't need statistics to know something had changed. They could feel it. The familiar cough of the Merlin when pushed beyond its limits was gone. The roar stayed steady now, fierce, confident, alive. At Duxford, Flight Lieutenant Robert Stamford Tuck pressed his Spitfire into a vertical dive against a pair of Bf-109s slicing through the morning haze. Before, he would have hesitated, afraid the carburetor would starve mid-turn. This time, he didn't even flinch. The Spitfire howled downward, guns blazing. Both German aircraft spiraled into the sea. When Tuck landed, his grin said everything. It's not just the engine that's fixed, it's our nerve. By April's end, RAF statistics confirmed it: -29 British fighters lost in combat, 94 German planes destroyed, a kill-to-loss ratio of 3.2 to 1. The restrictor wasn't the only factor. Improved tactics, radar coordination, and new aircraft models all played roles. But across Britain's airfields, everyone knew what had made the difference: Miss Shilling's Orifice. The name had begun as a joke, a cheeky bit of RAF humor courtesy of Stanley Hooker. Rolls-Royce's brilliant supercharger designer. Shilling herself laughed when she heard it. If it keeps them alive, she said, they can call it whatever they please. But beyond the jokes, pilots carried a quiet respect. They knew this wasn't a lab invention from someone who'd never seen an airfield. Shilling understood engines the way they did, by feel, by instinct, by the sound of a machine just before it quit. The modification spread like wildfire. Coastal Command wanted it for their Beaufighters. Bomber Command requested it for their trainers. Even the Fleet Air Arm sent word from carrier decks asking for the brass washer from Farnborough. Rolls-Royce ramped up production again, minus 1,000 restrictors a week by June. By midsummer, nearly every Merlin engine in service carried the small, hand-polished washer that had changed the war. By 1943, Rolls-Royce finally introduced the long-promised pressure carburetor, the ultimate fix. No float chamber, no flooding, pure, steady fuel injection under any condition. Engineers called it revolutionary. Pilots shrugged. To them, Miss Shilling's Orifice had already won. Installing the new carburetors required removing engines, rewiring, controls, 8 hours of downtime per aircraft. Fighter Command couldn't spare that kind of time. Not when German raids still came daily. So they kept flying with Shilling's restrictor, right into 1944. Some aircraft never replaced it, at all, because it worked. By then, Beatrice had moved on. The Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough never stopped giving her problems to solve. Engine starts in Arctic temperatures, fuel icing in high-altitude missions, carburetor behavior above 30,000 feet. Every issue ended up on her desk. When Spitfires were shipped to aid Soviet pilots in Murmansk, British mechanics struggled to start the engines at minus 40 F. Oil turned to paste. Batteries froze. Shilling improvised a solution, preheating fuel lines and modifying fuel mixtures with small alcohol content to prevent freezing. Within a week, Spitfires were flying combat missions again in the Arctic skies. Later, she tackled high-altitude fuel performance. The thin air robbed the Merlin engine of oxygen. Combustion ratios went haywire. Her fix, an altitude compensating adjustment, boosted performance by 8% at 35,000 feet. A small number, but in aerial combat, that could mean the difference between life and death. Her life at Farnborough was a balance between relentless technical work and private quiet. She'd married George Naylor, a fellow engineer turned RAF bomber pilot, while Beatrice spent nights solving equations. George spent his over the skies of Germany in a Lancaster. 31 missions, each one a coin toss with death. He survived, against all odds. When he returned in 1944, they rarely spoke of what each had seen. She never asked about the raids. He never asked about the restrictor. Their silence was an unspoken pact. Leave the war at the door. After the victory in 1945, the tempo at Farnborough slowed. Research replaced crisis. Peacetime replaced desperation. But Beatrice stayed. She didn't crave rank or recognition. She preferred oil-stained sleeves and machines that could be fixed by hand. In 1948, the Crown called her to Buckingham Palace. King George VI himself presented her with the Order of the British Empire for wartime service. Shilling accepted, smiled for the official photograph, and went back to the lab the next morning. She would stay at Farnborough for another 2 decades. Projects came and went, high-altitude superchargers, braking systems for jet runways, even aerodynamic studies for bobsled design. She never climbed into the administrative ranks. She didn't want to. Paperwork doesn't save lives, she'd say. Even in the jet age, her engineering mind never dulled. She co-authored studies on runway friction in wet conditions, preventing landing accidents that killed hundreds of pilots post-war. Her work saved lives long after the last Spitfire retired. When she finally retired in 1969, Beatrice returned to her first love, motorcycles. Her old Norton, the same one she'd raced before the war, was restored to perfection. She rode it across English country roads, wind in her face, solving problems that no longer existed. She passed away in 1990 at the age of 81, survived by her husband and the legacy of a small brass washer that had saved a generation of British pilots. Decades later, historians would call it one of the simplest, most effective wartime inventions ever made. Engineering schools taught it as an example of elegance under pressure, a 50-cent part that changed the war. They said. In 2019, the Royal Holloway University opened a building named after her, the Beatrice Shilling Engineering Center. A pub in Farnborough bears her name, and in museum cases across Britain, A few of those original restrictors sit behind glass, small, unremarkable, almost invisible. But to the pilots who once trusted their lives to them, they were priceless. The legacy of a woman who refused to wait for permission, and instead, built the solution herself. If this story inspired you the way it inspired us, do one simple thing: hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube that stories like this deserve to be seen by more people. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next forgotten piece of history we uncover. Every week, we bring you untold stories of engineers, soldiers, and ordinary people who changed the course of war and history through brilliance and bravery. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from: Pakistan, the US, the UK, India, or anywhere else in the world. Our community of history lovers is growing every day, and you're part of it. And if someone in your family ever served, share their story too. Because sometimes, real heroism doesn't happen on the battlefield. It happens in a workshop, behind a single brass washer, saving lives one idea at a time.